In the quiet of a Thursday afternoon, a single, broken sob echoes through a bank, shattering the calm. Amelia Donovan, a woman of power and grace, is drawn to the source, a young woman on the brink of despair. What begins as a chance encounter spirals into a life-changing connection that neither could have predicted. As Amelia extends a hand to Grace, a woman fighting for survival, they uncover a past that binds them in ways they never imagined. But can they navigate the hidden truths that emerge, and find hope where it seems lost? The bank was unusually quiet for a Thursday afternoon, with only the occasional murmur of conversation or the muted click of keyboards breaking the silence. Amelia Donovan, a woman of quiet elegance and understated power, stood near the entrance, waiting for her private banker to prepare some documents. The sharp scent of polished wood and the faint aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, offering a sense of familiarity and comfort in a space designed to exude calm professionalism. As Amelia checked her phone, a sound pierced the stillness, a soft, broken sob. It was the kind of cry that resonated deeply, a sound of someone who had tried to hold it together for too long and could no longer manage. Amelia's gaze drifted across the bank's pristine interior until it settled on the source. In a far corner, near a teller's counter, stood a young woman, her slight frame hunched over as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper in one hand, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her clothes, though clean, were worn and faded, and her long brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, the kind that suggested she hadn't had the time, or energy, to care much about her appearance. Her face was partially hidden by her hands as she tried, unsuccessfully, to stifle her tears. Amelia's curiosity was piqued, but more than that, a deep sense of empathy stirred within her. She was no stranger to moments of despair. She had faced more than her share on the long road to building her empire. But there was something about the girl's evident vulnerability that struck a chord in her, something that urged Amelia to look beyond the polished exterior of the bank and see the raw humanity that had just bled into this sterile environment. The young woman, Grace, Amelia would later learn, was speaking in a voice barely above a whisper to the teller, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. Amelia could only catch snippets of the conversation, but it was enough to piece together the story. "I've been trying. I don't know what else to do." Grace's voice was tremulous, the words heavy with exhaustion. The paper in her hand fluttered slightly as if it might slip from her grasp at any moment. The teller leaned in, her expression softening as she glanced at the screen in front of her. "I'm so sorry, but your account is still overdrawn. I wish there was something more I could do." Grace's shoulders slumped even further, her desperation palpable. She drew in a shaky breath and tried again, her voice thick with barely restrained tears. "But, my father's medical bills, they're due today. I just need a little more time. I'll find a way to pay it back, I promise." Amelia felt a tightening in her chest. She didn't need to hear any more to understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a missed payment or a temporary setback, it was about survival. The girl was fighting to keep her head above water, and the tide was pulling her under. Before she even realized what she was doing, Amelia found herself moving toward the counter. The click of her heels on the polished floor seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that had settled around them, drawing the attention of both Grace and the teller. Grace turned her head slightly, her tear-streaked face a mix of confusion and wariness. "Excuse me," Amelia said gently, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there something I can do to help?" Grace blinked, clearly taken aback. For a moment, she seemed too stunned to respond, her gaze flicking between Amelia and the teller as if she wasn't sure what was happening. I don't know," Grace stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her tears. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause a scene." "You're not causing a scene," Amelia replied softly. There was a calm authority in her voice, the kind that put people at ease without making them feel small. She glanced at the teller, who looked uncertain about whether to intervene or step back. "May I?" The teller, sensing Amelia's intent, nodded slightly and turned her attention back to her computer, subtly giving them space. Amelia focused on Grace, her gaze steady but compassionate. "My name is Amelia Donovan. I understand this might feel a little strange, but I'd like to help if I can. Sometimes, we all need a little assistance to get through difficult times." Grace's eyes widened slightly at the name, a flash of recognition crossing her face. It was hard not to recognize Amelia. Her name often appeared in the news, associated with large charity donations, successful business ventures, and the occasional high society event. But this was a side of Amelia that the media rarely showed, a woman who wasn't just wealthy, but deeply compassionate. I don't know what to say," Grace managed to whisper. "I'm not sure I can accept." Amelia shook her head gently, cutting her off. "There's no need to decide right now. But I've been where you are, maybe not in the exact same way, but close enough. If you'd like, we can sit down somewhere and talk. No strings attached, no expectations." Grace hesitated, her mind clearly racing as she tried to make sense of the offer. She had been fending for herself for so long, relying on her own strength and determination. Accepting help, especially from a stranger, was foreign to her. But there was something in Amelia's eyes, a sincerity that was hard to ignore, a quiet understanding that made Grace feel, for the first time in a long while, that she wasn't entirely alone. Okay, Grace said finally, her voice barely audible. She looked down at the crumpled paper in her hand, the stark reality of her situation refusing to let her go. "But, why?" Amelia smiled gently, her gaze softening. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most. It's only right that I do the same." For a moment, Grace said nothing, her mind grappling with the unexpected kindness. The walls she had built up, the ones that had kept her safe but isolated, began to crumble ever so slightly. Amelia, sensing Grace's internal struggle, decided not to press further. Instead, she motioned toward the small seating area by the windows, where they could talk more privately. "Why don't we sit down and take a moment? We can figure out the next steps together." Grace nodded, the gesture small and uncertain, but it was enough. As they walked over to the seating area, Amelia noticed the way Grace clung to the paper in her hand, as if it was a lifeline. She could only imagine the burden that piece of paper represented, the mounting debt, the fear of losing someone she loved, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. They sat down, the large windows letting in the soft afternoon light, casting a warm glow over the space. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with unspoken questions and emotions. Amelia broke the silence first, her voice gentle and steady. "Tell me about your father. What's he going through?" Grace looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of the paper nervously. He's been sick for a while. The medical bills, they just keep piling up. I've been doing everything I can, but it's never enough. I'm so scared of what might happen if I can't pay them." Her voice trailed off, thick with emotion. She didn't need to say more for Amelia to understand the depth of her fear. The desperation in Grace's voice was all too familiar. Amelia had heard it in her own voice years ago, when she was a young woman struggling to make ends meet. "I'm sorry you've had to carry this burden alone," Amelia said softly. "But you don't have to anymore. We'll find a way to help your father, and we'll make sure you're not alone in this." Grace looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. It was clear that she wanted to believe in Amelia's words, but years of hardship had made her wary of hope. "Why would you do this for me?" Grace asked again, her voice trembling with vulnerability. Amelia's expression softened even more, her heart aching for the young woman in front of her. "Because I believe in helping those who need it most. You remind me of someone I once knew, someone who needed a little help to get through a difficult time. If I can be that help for you, then it's worth it." Grace didn't respond immediately, her eyes searching Amelia's face for any sign of insincerity. But all she found was kindness and understanding, something she had longed for, but had almost given up on finding. Finally, Grace nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I don't know how I can ever repay you, but thank you." Amelia reached out and gently squeezed Grace's hand, a gesture of comfort and reassurance. You don't need to repay me. Just know that you're not alone anymore." As they sat there, the weight of Grace's burden seemed to lift ever so slightly. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Amelia knew that this was just the beginning, that there were still many challenges ahead. But in that quiet moment, with the afternoon sun warming the room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Helping Grace wasn't just about offering financial support, it was about giving her hope, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. And as they continued to talk, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were connected in ways neither of them fully understood yet. The pieces of the puzzle were just beginning to fall into place, and she was determined to see it through, whatever that might mean for both of them. The cafe was cozy, tucked away on a quiet side street not far from the bank. It was the kind of place where the scent of freshly ground coffee mingled with the warmth of baked goods, creating an atmosphere that felt both welcoming and intimate. Amelia Donovan and Grace Miller sat at a small table by the window, a steaming pot of tea between them. The afternoon light filtered through the glass, casting soft shadows across the table. Grace sat with her hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes focused on the swirling steam. The events at the bank had left her feeling unmoored, as if she were caught in a current she didn't understand. She still couldn't quite believe that Amelia Donovan, was sitting across from her, offering to help. Amelia watched Grace with quiet patience, sensing the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. She knew better than to rush the conversation, understanding that trust was something earned, not demanded. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes, words weren't necessary. After a few moments, Amelia broke the silence, her voice gentle. "I know this must feel overwhelming. You're probably wondering why I'm doing this." Grace looked up, meeting Amelia's gaze for the first time since they'd left the bank. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, but also with a glimmer of hope. "It just doesn't make sense. I don't understand why someone like you would want to help someone like me." Amelia smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I've learned that life is full of unexpected connections. Sometimes, we cross paths with people at just the right moment. I've had people help me when I least expected it, and it changed my life. Now, I try to do the same when I can." Grace listened, her fingers tightening around the teacup. She wanted to believe in Amelia's words, but years of struggling had made her cautious. She'd learned the hard way that people often had ulterior motives, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there might be more to Amelia's kindness than she was letting on. "I don't want to sound ungrateful," Grace began hesitantly, "but I've had people offer to help before, and it usually comes with strings attached. I'm not sure I can handle that right now." Amelia's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing through her eyes. "I get it. You've had to be strong for so long, and it's hard to trust that someone might actually want to help without expecting anything in return. But I can promise you, Grace, that I'm not here to complicate your life. I just want to make things a little easier for you, if you'll let me." Grace studied Amelia's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was a woman who seemed genuinely concerned, someone who wasn't just offering a handout, but something more meaningful. "I don't know what to say," Grace murmured, her voice wavering. "I've been on my own for so long. I'm not sure I even know how to accept help." Amelia reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Grace's. "You don't have to say anything right now. Let's take it one step at a time. For now, just know that you don't have to face this alone. We can figure it out together." Grace felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of Amelia's words sinking in. It had been so long since she'd heard someone say "we," since she'd felt like she was part of something bigger than just her own struggle. The realization brought a mix of relief and fear, relief that maybe she didn't have to bear the burden alone anymore, and fear of what it would mean to let someone in. Amelia, sensing Grace's internal conflict, gently changed the subject. "Tell me more about your father. What kind of man is he?" Grace blinked, caught off guard by the question. She hadn't talked about her father to anyone in a long time. Most people didn't ask, and she had become accustomed to keeping her worries to herself. But something about Amelia's tone made it easy to open up. "My dad, he's always been strong," Grace began, her voice softening as she spoke. "He used to work in construction. Built houses, did all kinds of repairs. He was always the first one to help someone out if they needed it, never expected anything in return. That's just the kind of person he is." Amelia nodded, encouraging her to continue. "He's been sick for a few years now," Grace continued, her voice growing more somber. "It started with his back, an injury he never fully recovered from. But then it got worse. Doctors said it was some kind of degenerative disease. He can't work anymore, and the medical bills just keep piling up. I've been trying to keep up with everything, but it's been hard." As Grace spoke, Amelia could hear the love and frustration in her voice, the sense of duty that had driven her to sacrifice so much of her own life to care for her father. It was a story Amelia understood all too well, having been through her own battles with loss and responsibility. "I can see how much he means to you," Amelia said softly. "It's clear that you've done everything you can to take care of him. That's something to be proud of, Grace." Grace looked down at her tea, the warmth of Amelia's words sinking into her heart. I don't want to lose him. He's all I have left." There was a moment of silence, filled with the quiet sounds of the cafe and the weight of Grace's emotions. Amelia let the silence linger, giving Grace the space to process what she had shared. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and reassuring. "You're not going to lose him," Amelia said firmly. "We'll make sure he gets the care he needs. I have connections with some of the best medical professionals in the country. We can get a second opinion, explore other treatment options, whatever it takes." Grace looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and disbelief. "You'd really do that? For someone you barely know?" Amelia smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I would. And it's not just for you, Grace. It's for your father, too. He sounds like a good man who deserves a chance. I want to help give him that." Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. She had been fighting for so long, and now, for the first time, it felt like she had someone in her corner. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to begin to thank you." "You don't have to," Amelia replied, her tone gentle. "Just focus on what's ahead. We'll take it one step at a time." As they continued to talk, the conversation flowed naturally, the initial tension between them easing into a comfortable rhythm. Amelia asked Grace about her life, her dreams, and the things she had set aside to care for her father. Grace found herself opening up more than she had in years, sharing stories about her love for music, her dreams of becoming a musician, and the way those dreams had been put on hold. Amelia listened intently, her heart aching for the sacrifices Grace had made. She could see the spark in Grace's eyes as she talked about music, a spark that had been dimmed by years of hardship but hadn't been completely extinguished. Amelia made a silent promise to herself in that moment, to do whatever she could to help Grace reignite that spark, to give her a chance to pursue her dreams once more. As the afternoon turned to evening, the light outside the cafe began to soften, casting a warm glow over the city. Amelia and Grace lingered in their conversation, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing moment. It was a bond born out of shared pain and mutual understanding, and though neither of them fully realized it yet, it was the beginning of something that would change both their lives. By the time they left the cafe, Grace felt lighter than she had in years. The world outside felt a little less daunting, a little less lonely. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to turn around. Amelia walked beside her, the two women stepping into the cool evening air. As they made their way down the quiet street, Amelia glanced at Grace and offered a reassuring smile. "We'll take it one day at a time, Grace. We'll figure this out together." Grace nodded, a small, hopeful smile spreading across her face. Together, she echoed softly, the word feeling strange but comforting on her lips. And as they walked away from the cafe, a sense of quiet determination settled over them both. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they weren't walking it alone anymore. They had each other now, and that made all the difference. The following morning, Amelia sat in her home office, a room filled with the quiet hum of activity that had come to define her life. The large windows overlooked the city skyline, but her eyes were focused on the papers spread across her desk. Financial reports, business proposals, and various documents competed for her attention, yet her mind kept drifting back to Grace. After their conversation at the cafe, something about Grace had lingered in Amelia's thoughts. The girl's quiet resilience, her willingness to carry such a heavy burden without complaint, it reminded Amelia of someone she had once known, someone who had slipped through her fingers a long time ago. Amelia shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside, but they persisted. There was something more, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Grace's story, her struggle, and the way she had clung to hope despite everything, there was a familiarity in it that Amelia couldn't ignore. Unable to focus on her work, Amelia stood and walked over to the large windows, letting her gaze drift over the city. The bustling streets below were a stark contrast to the silence in her office, a reminder of the life she had built, one of success and stability. But there were moments, like this one, when Amelia couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had lost along the way. Her thoughts turned to Grace's father, a man she had never met but who now seemed to occupy a significant space in her mind. The more she thought about him, the more she wondered about the life he had led and the sacrifices he had made for his daughter. And with that, a nagging question began to form in the back of her mind, a question that refused to be silenced. Amelia made a decision. She reached for her phone and called her assistant, a young woman named Sophia who had proven herself invaluable over the years. "Sophia, I need you to do some research for me." Discreetly. There was a brief pause on the other end before Sophia responded, her tone professional and efficient. "Of course, Ms. Donovan. What do you need?" Amelia hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to phrase her request. "I need you to look into a man named Thomas Miller. He's Grace's father. I'm looking for any information you can find, medical records, employment history, anything that might give us a better understanding of his situation." Sophia didn't question the request, she simply acknowledged it with a quiet "understood, I'll get on it right away." As Amelia ended the call, she felt a sense of unease settle over her. It wasn't like her to dig into someone's past without their knowledge, but there was something about Grace that compelled her to act. She needed to understand what was really going on, needed to know if there was more to this story than what Grace had shared. The day passed slowly, with Amelia moving through her tasks in a haze of distraction. She found herself returning to the same thoughts, the same questions, until finally, as evening approached, Sophia called back. "I've got some information for you," Sophia began, her voice careful. "It's interesting." Amelia's heart quickened slightly, a mix of anticipation and apprehension. "Go on." Thomas Miller was a construction worker for most of his life, Sophia explained, her voice steady as she relayed the information. He was well respected in his community, known for his integrity and work ethic. About 10 years ago, he suffered a serious injury on the job, which eventually led to a degenerative condition. He's been unable to work since then, and that's when the medical bills started piling up. Amelia listened intently, her mind piecing together the puzzle. And what about his personal life? Any mention of a significant other or family? There was a brief pause before Sophia continued. Thomas was married once, to a woman named Sarah. They were together for a few years before they separated. She passed away shortly after their divorce. Grace was just a child at the time. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The name Sarah echoed in her mind, stirring memories she had long buried. It couldn't be the same Sarah, could it? "Do you have any more details about Sarah?" Amelia asked, her voice more urgent now. Sophia hesitated, sensing the shift in Amelia's tone. "Not much, I'm afraid." She was a local artist, known for her paintings. She had a brief exhibition in a small gallery before she passed away. There isn't much else on record. Amelia's mind raced, connecting the dots in ways that left her feeling both exhilarated and fearful. She remembered Sarah, a woman she had known in her younger years, someone who had been a brief but important part of her life. They had lost touch as Amelia pursued her career, but the memories of that time remained vivid. And now, there was Grace, Sarah's daughter, struggling to survive in a world that had been unkind to her. The realization hit Amelia like a tidal wave, flooding her with a mix of emotions she hadn't expected. "Thank you, Sophia," Amelia said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate your help." As she hung up the phone, Amelia sank into her chair, her thoughts spinning. If Grace was Sarah's daughter, then Thomas Miller, he must have been the man Sarah had married after they lost touch. The man Amelia had never met, but who had clearly been a good father to Grace. Amelia leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. She had always wondered what had become of Sarah, had always felt a pang of guilt for letting their friendship slip away. And now, all these years later, she had stumbled upon the daughter of that lost friend, a girl who was facing a mountain of challenges with the same quiet strength Sarah had once possessed. The thought of Grace struggling alone, without the support she deserved, filled Amelia with a deep sense of responsibility. She had the power to help, and more than that, she felt a personal connection to Grace that went beyond mere charity. It was as if fate had given her a second chance to make things right, to be there for someone who needed her, someone who reminded her so much of the woman she had once cared for. The next morning, Amelia found herself standing outside Grace's apartment, a modest building in a quiet neighborhood. She had called Grace earlier, asking if they could meet to discuss the next steps. Grace had agreed, though Amelia could hear the hesitation in her voice. She knew that Grace was still unsure of her motives, still struggling to accept the help being offered. When Grace opened the door, she looked surprised to see Amelia standing there. "Amelia? I wasn't expecting you to come here." Amelia smiled warmly, sensing Grace's unease. "I thought it might be easier to talk somewhere you're comfortable. May I come in?" Grace hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, allowing Amelia to enter. The apartment was small but tidy, with simple furniture and a few personal touches that made it feel like a home. There were framed photos on the walls, most of them of Grace and her father, and a small stack of music books on a table by the window. Amelia took in her surroundings with quiet appreciation, noting the care that Grace had put into making the space her own. It was clear that this apartment was more than just a place to live, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the hardships of the outside world. "Thank you for meeting with me," Amelia began as they sat down in the living room. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation yesterday, and I wanted to talk to you about something that's been on my mind." Grace looked at Amelia with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, clearly unsure of what to expect. "I did some research," Amelia continued, choosing her words carefully. "About your father, and about your mother." Grace's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "My mother? She passed away a long time ago." "I know," Amelia said softly. "But before she did, she was a talented artist. She even had a small exhibition at a gallery downtown." Grace nodded, her eyes clouding with the memory. "I've seen some of her paintings. My dad kept a few of them. He said she was really good." "She was," Amelia agreed, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "And I think she would be proud of you, Grace. For everything you've done, for how strong you've been." Grace looked down, her emotions clearly stirred by Amelia's words. "I hope so. I've always tried to live up to what she would have wanted." There was a moment of silence, filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Amelia took a deep breath, knowing that the next word she spoke could change everything. "Grace," she began gently, "I knew your mother. We were friends, a long time ago. I didn't realize it at first, but when I learned who you were, everything clicked into place." Grace's eyes widened, shock and confusion washing over her. You knew her? But how? Why didn't she ever tell me? Amelia shook her head, her voice tinged with regret. We lost touch before she met your father. I didn't know what had happened to her until now. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this, Grace. I'm here for you, not just because of our connection, but because I care about you. Grace was silent for a long moment, her mind racing as she tried to process the revelation. The connection between them was deeper than she had ever imagined, and it left her feeling both vulnerable and strangely comforted. I don't know what to say, Grace whispered, her voice trembling. This is all so much. I know, Amelia said softly, reaching out to gently squeeze Grace's hand. But we'll take it one step at a time. Just know that you're not alone anymore. We'll face this together. As Grace looked into Amelia's eyes, she felt a surge of emotion that she couldn't quite name. It was a mix of relief, fear, and something that felt a lot like hope. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was fighting a losing battle. She had someone in her corner, someone who understood, someone who cared. And as they sat there, in the quiet of Grace's apartment, both women knew that this was the beginning of something new. The road ahead would be difficult, but they were no longer walking it alone. They had each other, and that made all the difference. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Grace. The revelation that Amelia had known her mother, Sarah, was something she had never expected, and it left her grappling with a mix of curiosity and unease. Questions swirled in her mind, about her mother's past, about Amelia's life before she became the successful woman she was today, and about how all these threads had somehow woven their way into Grace's own life. Amelia, for her part, was patient. She knew Grace needed time to process everything, so she didn't push. Instead, she focused on what she could do to help Grace and her father, Thomas, while also navigating the complicated emotions that had surfaced within herself. She felt a deep responsibility toward Grace, not just because of their shared connection to Sarah, but because she saw so much of herself in the young woman, both the strength and the vulnerability. One afternoon, Amelia found herself driving to a part of the city she hadn't visited in years. It was a quieter neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle of the city center, where the buildings were older, and the streets were lined with trees that had stood for decades. This was where Sarah had lived all those years ago, where she and Amelia had spent so many afternoons talking about their dreams and their futures. Amelia hadn't been back since those days, but something had drawn her here now, a need to reconnect with a past she had long left behind. As Amelia parked her car and stepped out onto the sidewalk, she took a moment to gather herself. The neighborhood had changed, but there was still a sense of familiarity in the air, a feeling that brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. She walked slowly, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, until she reached the small house that had once been Sarah's home. It was still there, a little more worn around the edges, but with the same charm that Amelia remembered. The front yard was overgrown with wildflowers, and the paint on the shutters was peeling, but the house still exuded a quiet warmth. Amelia stood at the gate, taking in the sight, her mind flooded with memories. She remembered the first time she had visited this house, the way Sarah had welcomed her with open arms, eager to share her world. They had been so close then, two young women with big dreams and even bigger hearts. Amelia could still hear Sarah's laughter, see the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about her art, her hopes for the future. But life had pulled them in different directions. Amelia had pursued her career with relentless determination, while Sarah had chosen a different path, one that had eventually led to Thomas and, later, Grace. And now, standing here, Amelia couldn't help but feel the weight of the choices she had made, the paths not taken, the friendships that had faded with time. With a deep breath, Amelia pushed open the gate and walked up the stone path to the front door. She knew that no one lived here now, the house had been vacant since Sarah's passing. But she felt compelled to be here, to stand in the place where her friend had once lived and loved. As she reached the porch, Amelia hesitated. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, what she hoped to find in this place that was now just a shadow of the past. But something inside her told her that this visit was important, that she needed to reconnect with the memories she had buried for so long. Gently, she pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing an interior that was dimly lit by the afternoon sun filtering through the dusty windows. The house had been cleared out long ago, but the faint scent of old wood and the lingering essence of Sarah's presence still filled the air. Amelia stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The living room was just as she remembered it, small but cozy, with a fireplace that had once been the heart of the home. She could almost see Sarah sitting there, a cup of tea in her hand, talking animatedly about her latest painting. Her eyes drifted to the mantel, where a few framed photos still stood, left behind by whoever had last lived here. Amelia's heart clenched as she recognized one of them, a photo of Sarah and a young Grace, taken when Grace was just a toddler. They were at the park, laughing, the sun shining down on them as Sarah held Grace in her arms. Amelia picked up the photo, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the outline of Sarah's face. She had been so happy then, so full of life and love. And Grace, Amelia could see the resemblance now, the same spark in her eyes that Sarah had once had. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as Amelia set the photo back down, overwhelmed by the emotions that had been stirred up by this visit. She had always regretted losing touch with Sarah, but standing here now, in the home that had once been so full of life, that regret felt even more profound. But there was something else, too, a sense of resolution. Amelia knew that she couldn't change the past, couldn't go back and fix what had been broken. But she could be here now, for Grace, for the daughter of the friend she had once loved so dearly. And in doing so, maybe she could find a way to honor Sarah's memory, to make amends for the time they had lost. As she turned to leave, something caught Amelia's eye, a small, worn book lying on the windowsill. She walked over and picked it up, brushing off the dust. It was a sketchbook, one that had clearly seen years of use. Amelia opened it carefully, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized Sarah's delicate pencil strokes on the pages. The sketches were beautiful, filled with scenes of nature, portraits of people, and abstract designs that hinted at the emotions Sarah had poured into her work. Amelia flipped through the pages slowly, each drawing a testament to Sarah's talent and her passion for art. But it was the final pages that brought Amelia to a halt. There, among the sketches, was a drawing of a young woman, a woman who looked strikingly like Grace. The detail was exquisite, capturing the essence of the girl who had grown up in this very house. Tucked inside the back cover was a letter, yellowed with age. Amelia unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she began to read. The letter was addressed to Grace, written in Sarah's familiar handwriting. It was filled with words of love and hope, a mother's wishes for her daughter's future. Amelia's eyes filled with tears as she read Sarah's final message to Grace, a message that spoke of dreams, of resilience, and of the importance of finding one's own path in life. Sarah had known that she wouldn't always be there for Grace, but she had wanted her daughter to know that she was loved, that she was strong enough to face whatever challenges life might throw her way. When Amelia finished reading, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the sketchbook. She knew what she needed to do. This book, this piece of Sarah's soul, belonged to Grace. It was a part of her heritage, a link to the mother who had loved her so deeply. Leaving the house, Amelia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would give Grace the sketchbook, but more than that, she would be there for her in the way she wished she could have been there for Sarah. She would help Grace find her way, just as Sarah had wanted. As Amelia drove back to the city, the sketchbook resting on the seat beside her, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was still theirs to shape. And in that future, Amelia would ensure that Grace had the support she needed to pursue her dreams, just as Sarah had always wanted for her. Back in the city, Amelia found herself at Grace's apartment once again, the sketchbook in her hands. When Grace opened the door, she looked surprised to see Amelia standing there, but there was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I found something," Amelia said softly, holding out the sketchbook. "It's from your mother." Grace's eyes widened as she took the book from Amelia, her fingers trembling as she opened it. As she flipped through the pages, recognition dawned on her face, followed by tears that she didn't try to hold back. This This was hers, Grace whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought it was lost. Amelia nodded, her own voice thick with emotion. I found it in her old house. I thought you should have it. Grace looked up at Amelia, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, a connection that went beyond words. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't have to, Amelia replied gently. Just know that I'm here for you, Grace. Whatever you need, whatever your dreams are, I'm here to help you make them a reality. Grace nodded, her tears flowing freely now. I don't feel so alone anymore, she admitted softly. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a family. Amelia smiled, a tear slipping down her own cheek. You do, Grace. You do. And as they stood there, in the quiet of Grace's apartment, the bond between them solidified, two women connected by the past, but looking toward a future they would build together. The days grew longer as spring slowly turned into summer. The city, bathed in warm sunlight, felt alive with possibilities. Amelia and Grace had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, their connection deepening as they spent more time together. Amelia's visits to Grace's apartment became more frequent, and their conversations grew more personal, touching on subjects that went beyond their shared past. One morning, as they sat in a small cafe near Grace's apartment, the air filled with the rich aroma of coffee and the quiet hum of conversation, Amelia decided it was time to address the future. She had been thinking a lot about Grace's life, her unfulfilled dreams, and the weight of responsibility that had shaped her into the strong, resilient woman she was today. Amelia wanted to help Grace reclaim the dreams she had set aside, but she knew it had to be done carefully, with Grace fully on board. As they sipped their coffee, Amelia glanced at Grace, who was looking out the window, lost in thought. The sun cast a soft glow on her face, highlighting the quiet determination in her eyes. It was a determination Amelia had come to admire deeply. Grace, Amelia began gently, drawing her attention. I've been thinking a lot about your music. Grace looked at her, surprise flickering across her face. My music? Yes, Amelia continued, her tone thoughtful. You've talked about it before, how much you loved playing the piano, how it was once a big part of your life. I can see how much it still means to you. Grace's expression softened, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. I haven't played in a long time, she admitted. There just hasn't been time, with everything going on. Amelia nodded, understanding the sacrifices Grace had made. I know you've had to put it aside, but I think it's time for you to start thinking about what you want for your future. You've spent so much of your life taking care of others, first your mother, and now your father. But what about you, Grace? What are your dreams? Grace hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were wrapped around her coffee cup. I don't know, she said quietly. It's been so long since I've thought about that. My life has been about survival for so many years, I'm not sure I even remember how to dream. Amelia reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Grace's. You don't have to figure it all out right now, she said softly. But I want you to know that it's okay to dream again. It's okay to think about what makes you happy, what fulfills you. And if music is something that still calls to you, I want to help you find your way back to it. Grace looked up, meeting Amelia's gaze with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. You really think I can do that? After all this time? I know you can, Amelia replied firmly. You have a gift, Grace. And gifts like that don't just disappear. Maria listened, her heart swelling with pride and compassion. She could see how hard it was for David to speak of his past, to face the pain he had caused. But she also saw the strength it took for him to come back, to try to rebuild what had been broken. And in that moment, she knew she could forgive him, fully, without reservation. When the conversation finally wound down, a peaceful silence settled over them. Emily, her head resting on David's shoulder, had fallen asleep, her small body tucked against his side. Her grandmother sat nearby, her knitting forgotten in her lap, a contented smile on her face. Maria looked around at the people she loved, feeling a deep sense of peace. For the first time in years, Maria felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The future was still uncertain, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but they would face them together, as a family. And as she watched the firelight dance in the hearth, she felt a warmth in her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. This was a new beginning, a chance to build something beautiful out of the ashes of the past. And as Maria closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over her, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it with love, with hope, and with the unbreakable bond of family.